morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining me from. And thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to be with me today on this 1-hour webinar on acceptance criteria versus scenarios, writing better user stories with Rommana ALM. In fact, the webinar will discuss the topic regardless whether you have Rommana ALM or not as your ALM tool. However, at the end of the webinar, I might take 10 or 15 minutes to show you how Rommana ALM actually supports both acceptance criteria and scenarios. My name is Hanna. I'm Chief Technical Officer of Rommana Software. Some of you might already know me through the International Institute for Software Testing. All right, well, let's get started though. Before I get started, would make a lot of sense to ask how many of you are actually working on agile projects. If you are currently, or even in the past, worked in an agile project, please go ahead and raise your hand. Okay, almost everyone. And I will assume that if you work with agile projects, you're familiar with the concept of user stories and acceptance criteria. However, because of those who have not really worked with agile projects, I'm going to take a few minutes to review some of the concepts so that it would make more sense to you when I speak about the difference between acceptance criteria and scenarios and when to use one or the other or both. Right? So with that being said, everyone knows that a user story is a simple statement describing what the user wants or what the user who is using the system want to do with the system. It is claimed that user stories are good because it is always written in the language of the user of the system, which makes sense. And it focuses on who is doing or who would like to do the task and what they'd like to do. But as we know, it does not address how the task should be performed, right? And there is a specific format that people suggested for user stories. Here is the format. As an actor, I want to do certain action so that the last phrase, people call it achievement, people call it cause, people call it explanation, whatever you want to call it. I put an example down there. As a customer, I want to be able to check the status of my order. Why do I want to do that? Because so that I know when I will receive it. Just a point of view here. I don't normally care much about the last phrase, which is called achievement. Because for some user stories, sometimes it does not add anything. Okay, so very often when I write user stories, I don't put that clause at the end. So I just put who the actor is and what action is. All right, I'm going very quick, as you can see, so that we can have more time for the more detailed topic. Okay, so there is a concept of an epic, which is a large user story. Same thing we had when we worked with requirements. An epic is a large user story that needs to be decomposed or broken down to a number of smaller user stories. If you look at the epic at the top, as a passenger, I want to be able to check into my flight online and to get my boarding pass. As you can see here, I did not put the so that clause because again, for this epic, I didn't know what if it is going to add anything or if it was going to add anything. If you, in your opinion, have a reason to add the so that clause, please go ahead and share with me on the questions tab what you would put here on the so that. I just want you to kind of either agree or disagree with me with my point of view about the fact that sometimes that so that clause might not make much sense. Okay. As you can see, this epic has been broken down or could be broken down to a number of user stories or smaller user stories, and I only put 3 of them here. It doesn't mean that these are the only 3 that will be that we can break this Epic 2. As a passenger, I want to be able to select a seat. That's certainly part of checking into the flight and getting my boarding pass. As a passenger, I want to be able to upgrade my seat to first class. Or as a passenger, I want to be able to receive my boarding pass on my mobile device, and so on. And you can add probably easily 10, 15 other user stories. Okay, so, but that's not our topic today. Breaking it down an epic to smaller user stories or simpler user stories is a given, and we do it all the time. And this is not any different from what we have done when we use the requirements as opposed to user stories. Next, I want to share with you, if you attended my webinar last week on managing user stories, probably have seen this slide before, if you remember, but I'm going to review it very quick. Just wanted to share with you my opinion, my point of view about user stories. It's not a criticism of the user stories. I am not asking you to stop using user stories, but we got to be aware of limitations of user stories. They are certainly too brief and very high level. They don't give enough details, and they don't give you anything about the context in which the user story will be executed. Some people say the "so that" clause at the end gives you context. I disagree. But most importantly, if you think about user stories, not everything the system needs to do or must do involves a user. If the format is always as an actor, I want to do this. Okay, what are we going to do with those other things that the system does on its own without the involvement of a user? And you better believe that every system on Earth would always do things that do not involve the user. So as a result, I would have hard time phrasing those things as user stories. And that's why when I do that, I rather leave those things that the system must do without the involvement of any user. I just write them as requirements. Things like system shall calculate state sales taxes at the rate of 8%. Okay, no user is going to say, as a customer, I want to be able to see that the system is calculating taxes. In fact, as a customer, I don't want the system to calculate the taxes. But no, just as point of view, okay? Now, as I always tell people, when we write requirements or user stories, we must always pay attention to what I call shall not do behavior. Shall not do. We always get so busy talking about the things the system must do or the things we would like to do with the system, but we forget completely that there are so many other things the system shall not do or should not do that are very critical, because if the system actually does them, things are going to break. So that's why when we come to speak about scenarios, that's when I will show you how you can address the shall not do behavior using scenarios, because it's hard to do it with user stories by themselves or even with acceptance criteria. The last thing I want to say, that all the quality requirements, or you want to call them quality objectives or whatever you want to call them, things like, response time should not exceed 30 seconds, things that have to do with security, with safety, with reliability. Again, one more time, it's hard, almost impossible to phrase those things as user stories. That's where user stories fall short in describing these things. One more time, as you are going to see, if we have the time to show you how Rommana ALM does that, those things, I leave them as requirements. That's why I strongly believe that if you are going to use a tool that manages your user stories, the tool must allow you to maintain both user stories and requirements seamlessly. If you want to phrase something as a requirement, something that system shall do, system shall not do, whatever, you do that. If you want to phrase things as a user story, there is no magic. There is no magic to the format of the user story. Okay, it's just someone invented the format as an actor I want to do this just to look different from the way we wrote requirements. It didn't add anything to us except it is specifying the actor who is performing this action. However, it did limit us from expressing or describing other things as I described, whether they are quality issues, whether they are shall not do's, or anything that does not involve the system. So going on, and I'm trying to go faster as I said. Now we're going to talk about acceptance criteria now. Now, as you know, if you have used user stories, everyone realized that user stories by themselves are not detailed enough, and many practitioners who are using user stories started to use acceptance criteria. Maybe I should ask at this point, how many of you attending with me today actually write or have worked on projects that use acceptance criteria for user stories? I am only getting about 30% of people attending with me today saying they are using acceptance criteria. So that makes me surprised, because we know user stories by themselves are not detailed enough. And by the way, I already asked the question before, and I said, how many of you are using user stories? And I got almost everyone. So now the question is, if you are not using acceptance criteria to provide you with more details about user stories, how would developers even go about building the design and writing the code for user stories? And how would testers go about writing test cases for user stories? Please go ahead. For those of you who did not raise their hands, who are not using acceptance criteria, share with me, please. Share with me, because at least I want to learn how are you doing in your projects? How are you doing it? If there's any way at all that I can use user stories without acceptance criteria, I would not recommend that. Someone saying, I've seen some teams document the test cases off the user stories instead of acceptance criteria. Well, yeah, I don't know if that's a good idea, because typically acceptance criteria would, in fact, give you some guidance to write not only test cases, but most importantly, developers writing the design and writing the code for the user stories. Okay, so it looks like we are confirming somehow that some of you actually, in fact, or the majority of you are not using acceptance criteria in connection with user stories. But thanks for sharing this with me. Okay, I'm going to go ahead. All right, as you can see, the reason we have acceptance criteria is because user stories are brief, very high level. So we typically have some discussions, and then based on those discussions, we add some acceptance criteria. Let's look at a definition of what acceptance criteria are. They're simply a list of items that are used to do any or all of the following. Most importantly, acceptance criteria help us establish the boundaries of the user stories, because the more details you add to the user story, and I'm not suggesting that we are changing the user story itself, but rather we are adding more items, or a list of items, as we're going to see in a little bit, by which we can add more details to the user stories. When we do that, we can establish the boundaries of the user stories, meaning that I mean, you could also say we're establishing the scope of the user story, meaning that we're trying to understand what's included, or what's included in the user story and what's not included. So, for example, for a user story that talks about I want to be able to change my seat assignment, or I want to upgrade my seat to first class. So as a passenger, I would like to be able to upgrade my seat to first class. If someone adds an acceptance criteria to say, for example, I want to be able to pay for my upgraded seat using miles. So that will determine whether paying for upgraded seat using miles is part of the user story or not. So someone can say, no, we only will allow people to upgrade their seat to first class by paying using a credit card. To pay by miles is going to be done in the next sprint. So that's how the discussion would go on to establish the scope or the boundaries of the user stories. Yeah, most importantly, we use acceptance criteria to develop tests, and the purpose of that is to confirm. So users, if I develop tests for all the acceptance criteria that developers agreed to, okay, then if those tests pass, then we have a confirmation that the developer did what they needed to do to implement the user story correctly. Of course, as I said earlier, acceptance criteria or writing acceptance criteria and discussing them gives us a way to discuss things together. So it stimulates teams thinking. And of course, acceptance criteria are always a moving target. You can always add more, you can remove some, or you can add some. Here's an example for you. That's one user story. As a passenger, I want to be able to upgrade my seat to first class. Wow, I just use this example in my discussion. I'm going to put this example in front of you, and if you have used acceptance criteria before, may I hope that you can share with me some of the acceptance criteria that you could possibly write for such a user story. Again, and this webinar is not about writing acceptance criteria or teaching you how to write acceptance criteria. In fact, it's about showing you that acceptance criteria are hard and difficult to work with. But go ahead, if you're used to writing acceptance criteria, you should write 2 or 3 acceptance criteria for this user story in a matter of a minute. Okay, go ahead. And I will be watching here for a minute to see if I'm going to get anything. Now, you can imagine if you cannot think of acceptance criteria very quick, that would tell you that writing acceptance criteria is not that easy. And that's one of the points I'm going to be making today. All right, I got one acceptance criteria here. Show portal or system to capture the booking. Okay, well, this acceptance criteria is not really in the scope or within the boundaries of this user story, because this user story is explicitly about what? Upgrading my seat to first class. All right, another user story, show upgrade / downgrade options. Another example, given that I am a passenger on a flight that has not yet left, when I have already been assigned a seat, then I can click a button to change seat to first class. Okay, everyone will tell you that this is a very long acceptance criteria, because acceptance criteria are meant to be very short and brief. Okay, but again, as you can see, there is no specific way to write acceptance criteria. Let me share with you a couple more here from the audience. Show payment option. Can you see now? Writing acceptance criteria is a very broad thing. There is nothing that limits us to what to say. Show payment options, show upgrade, degrade option, or upgrade, downgrade options, show portal or system to capture the booking. I mean, it's endless. And working with teams that work with acceptance criteria, I almost gave up. Okay, because if you sit down and write 50 of those, no one says all those 50s are within the scope or the boundaries of the user story. Not only that, no one would even know that even if you test all those acceptance criteria, that means that the user story has been implemented correctly. So let me and thanks so much to those of you who have shared their opinion and their acceptance criteria. All right, here are my own examples. I'm not saying that those acceptance criteria are any better than the ones you wrote or provided. Okay, passenger pays for the upgrade using a credit card. Passenger can upgrade any time during the check-in process. Passenger may upgrade some or all passengers on the same reservation. Now, you can see, I started to think in a direction that's very different from all the other directions that many of you thought in. So what does it mean? Okay, it means that Acceptance criteria is almost unlimited. And if you have 5 people or even 3 people sitting there looking at this user story, you can get 3 sets of acceptance criteria that are very different from each other. That does not really help, because then we're going to say who's right and who's wrong. Are we supposed to have 3 or 5 people developing acceptance criteria? Of course, we're always supposed to have acceptance criteria being reviewed. So you can continue to work with acceptance criteria as you wish. I'm not going to tell you not to. However, let me share with you the concept of a scenario that I've been teaching to people and I've been using for the last, maybe over 20 years now. I've used the scenarios in non-agile projects, and I continue to use scenarios in agile projects. I've used the scenarios with user stories before acceptance criteria even existed. And I continue to use scenarios with user stories even with acceptance criteria being used. And when I go and help organizations build their user stories, work with their agile projects, I get mixed opinions. Some people say, "Oh, we're just gonna eliminate acceptance criteria. We're gonna continue just to use scenarios." And some people say, "No, we're gonna use acceptance criteria as a first shot at the details. Then we're gonna add even more details using scenarios." So let's talk about scenarios. What are scenarios? What is a scenario? Of course, scenario, as you can imagine, is a very generic term that means different things to different people. Here is what a scenario means in Rommana ALM. Keep in mind, Rommana ALM is an application lifecycle management tool that supports both acceptance criteria and scenarios. And this is how Rommana ALM and the methodologies behind Rommana ALM define a scenario. And I found this to work great. I had the privilege to work with teams all over the globe doing different kind of projects. I've worked with mission critical systems. I've worked with medical devices, and I always found that people like scenarios because they really capture everything about a user story or a requirement. It doesn't matter if you're agile project or a non-agile project using requirements or user stories. So it is a simple phrase describing any condition or any situation or even any event that could possibly happen in production when the user story or the requirement is performed by the system, not necessarily by the user. Okay, as I told you, many of the system actions do not even involve the users. So at the end, anything we talk about, whether it is a requirement or a user story, is going to be performed by the system. So the exercise of finding scenario is simply doing some brainstorming to say, okay, if the system is doing this kind of thing, what could possibly happen? And of course, the methodology has more details to it that says those conditions or situations or events could happen because of the user did something, or because of the system did something, or because there are some event that happened, like for example, we got a system failure. A system failure by itself is a situation or a condition or an event that causes a bunch of scenarios to exist. Okay, so system fails, then what should happen? What could possibly happen when we have one of the components of the system failing? For example, I'm trying to pay for my ticket or for my order on Amazon, for example, and then the gateway that's processing payment goes down. What could possibly happen? I mean, the fact that the gateway that's processing payment goes down is an event, and associated with that event a number of scenarios. Okay, someone is trying to actually submit their credit card while the gateway is down. Now, I don't know if acceptance criteria allow you to think all that. Okay, so we need to talk about this scenario. We need to think about it. We need to find out how the system will handle it. And this is strictly what I call one of the abnormal, extreme, uncommon scenarios. All conditions and situations, expected or unexpected, we need to think about them, normal or abnormal. whether initiated by the user or not. So that's the mindset of the brainstorming. That's what we use to write scenarios. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you example scenarios. I'm going to use the same user stories, the same user story that I used in the previous example. As a passenger, I want to be able to upgrade my seat to first class. Let me show you the different kind of things that can happen while the system is processing the upgrade, or while someone is trying to upgrade. So bear with me. One passenger on a reservation upgrading to first class while seat in first class is available. And you would agree this situation is different from the next one. One passenger on the reservation upgrading to first class while there is no seat available. See, I want you, when you see those scenarios, to think in the back of your mind, would you have really written acceptance criteria to address that? One passenger on the reservation upgrading to first class while he or she already had coach seat assigned. And that would raise a question. Can people upgrade to first class seat if they don't have a seat assigned in coach? Of course, of course. See, that's exactly where the discussion of the scope or the boundary of the user story comes. So one passenger on the reservation upgrading first class, he did not have a coach seat assigned. This is the opposite of the previous scenario. So now this one is using an invalid credit card. Of course, someone says, are you not going to write a scenario for someone to use a valid credit card? Of course, but that's what I call the plain vanilla scenario that we're going to write anyway. And even if I forget to write it, it's going to be tested anyway. So I'm trying to write scenarios to help two main things. One, to help the developers find the stuff that makes difference and they worry about it. I bet if you give the user story to the developers to write the code, they're not going to address even 80% of those scenarios. So that's why we write the scenarios. And the trick is, of course, the same way we do with acceptance criteria. We write those scenarios before developers even start writing the code or the design. Why? Because I want developers to consider all those scenarios when they write the code. And if they have a problem considering all these scenarios, then we discuss it. Then we talk about it. Then we decide if those scenarios are within the scope of the user story or not. And if the decision is made that they are within the user story, then the code needs to address them and the test cases need to address them. I said I'm trying to achieve two things. One of them is to get developers to write the code correctly. And that's why I tell the testers all the time, if you write scenarios and share those scenarios with developers, you are really helping developers writing a better code. You are helping developers implement the user story more correctly. By the way, this whole discussion about scenarios I've discussed it in more details in a 3-day course. I have a 3-day course that I teach through the International Institute for Software Testing, and the course is called The Best Practices in Software Test Planning and Design. So the whole course is around the methodology of using scenario, my methodology, which is called scenario-based development and testing. I also have free webinars on scenario-based development and testing. I think there's one already recorded at the Rommana website, but we're scheduling another one to be done soon. So if you are interested in the concept of scenarios and how to write scenarios, go ahead and watch the free webinar on scenario-based development and testing. And of course, if you need more 1 hour, then you can subscribe to my 3-day course with the International Institute for Software Testing. Okay, I'm continuing here. One passenger tries to upgrade after the check-in is complete. Okay, is that possible or not possible? We don't know. That's why we're going to have a discussion. Okay, is the upgrade allowed only while I am checking in to the flight to get my boarding pass? And that's a good example of what? Of what I refer to as shall not do. So we have a hidden situation here, an implicit requirement that says what? System shall not allow people to upgrade their seat to first class after they have already completed their check-in. No one has written this in a requirement or in a user story, but I am exposing this now in a scenario. Okay, now more scenarios, and I can go on and on and on and write more and more scenarios. There are so many scenarios, and just so here now I'm talking about multiple passengers on a reservation upgrading to first class, and all had coach seat assigned. That's versus the second scenario that says what? Some of them are upgraded and some of them are not. And the third scenario, some of them had coach seat assigned, some of them are not. So you can think about all the variations, and you would agree that 100% that any of those scenarios can happen. And we better make sure that we test this. I'm sorry, I kind of shifted a little bit to talk about scenarios in much more details, but I wanted to show you how scenarios are different from acceptance criteria. Okay? Now, final word about scenarios is that it is a teamwork, because a lot of people say, how am I going to write scenarios by myself? You cannot. If you are forced to work on scenarios by yourself, at the very least, you must put your scenarios out for review by the project team. And who's the project team? Your testers, your developers, your product owner. If your project is not agile, then your team is again your developer, your testers, and your business analysts, your customer, if the customer is available, whoever, anyone else who cares. And you must get those scenarios reviewed before the design and the code starts. Again, this is the scenario-based development and testing methodology that you can learn about some other time. Okay, I've got some comments here. I'll get back to those in a little bit. Let me go on, because I can see I'm running behind schedule. I have only roughly 19 minutes left, and I need to get going because I still have a lot of material to cover here. Now, one of the things about scenarios is I can focus on what I call negative scenarios versus positive scenarios. The plain vanilla normal scenarios, like customers upgrading to first class using a valid credit card, I'm going to refer to this as a positive scenario. It is the normal course of action. Customer is trying to, you see, all my scenarios are phrased in the form of what? Of a situation or a condition or an event that could happen. Customer is upgrading to first class for all passengers on the same reservation. Again, plain vanilla scenario. It's not abnormal. It's not extreme. It's not uncommon. We're not using invalid data. Now, negative scenarios, on the other hand, are three types of scenarios. Any scenario where we use invalid data, like invalid credit card, for example. Okay? Any scenario that describes abnormal, extreme, uncommon situation. Okay? And sometimes it's a gray area. You don't know if this is abnormal or normal, which is okay. I'm not forcing you to classify scenarios to negative and positive, and it would be a big mistake if you classify them incorrectly. No, I'm just saying that thinking scenarios will allow you to think a positive versus negative. Okay, so system failure is an example of abnormal condition or abnormal scenario. Like the example I just gave you, the gateway that process payment is down. Okay, two people are competing on the same seat at the same time. So is a reasonable scenario, is a reasonable what I would call uncommon scenario in the user story about assigning a seat. So if two users are competing on the same seat, or to get the same seat, that's uncommon. And it's scenario, it's an uncommon scenario. Now, shall not do's, I just to give you an example. Okay, someone is trying to upgrade to first class after they have already completed the check-in. That is a shall not do situations. Okay, someone is trying to upgrade their seat to first class after the flight already took off. Could that possibly happen? Well, what if someone tries it? Do we even allow it? Do we, what should the system handle that? Okay. We want to make sure that the reservation is not changeable after the flight took off, and so on. So keep that in mind. Now, it goes without saying, and I don't even need to tell you that, all negative scenarios serve two purposes. One, it helps developers pay attention to things that they normally don't think about. Because as you probably know it very well, okay, with all respect to our great developers, developers do not think negative. Developers do not think negative. So we are forcing our developers to think negative by giving them negative scenarios. That's all what it is. So that's the one thing negative scenarios are trying to achieve. The other thing is that they help me build my negative test cases. Now, because as testers, we normally, again, don't think too much of negative testing. And I ask people all the time, how much negative testing do you do compared to positive testing? And guess what? I get surprises. Many people say, oh, 10% negative, 15% negative, 20% negative. And when I start covering my techniques in that course of best practices, people realize that negative testing is supposed to be at least 5 to 10 times the amount of positive testing we do. If you're not convinced, you got to see that course. You got to see my approach to negative testing. And negative testing, as you can imagine, or negative scenarios are the ones that kills us all the time. All right, I'm going to go further. My gosh, there's a lot of material here. Another thing I do with scenarios is the risk-based testing. Okay, I put my scenarios there. I specify impact of failure, frequency of occurrence of that scenario, probability of failure, and based on these three parameters, I calculate a what I call a testing priority that tells me that how critical this scenario is for testing. Some scenarios are very critical because they have high impact of failure, high frequency, they have high, and so if I represent, the way we calculate this, by the way, it's not that difficult. High means 3, medium means 2, low is 1. So if you code them that way, then that's 3 plus 3 plus 3 divided by 3. So this is the average of the three values. So now if you go down here, 3 plus 1 plus 1, that's 5 divided by 3 gives you 1.23. So this scenario is one of the lowest. Actually, this is the one that's the lowest because everything is low here. So as you can tell, now I can decide on how many scenarios I'm going to test, how many scenarios I'm not going to test it, because when you use my scenario process, you will, as I always tell people, you will create much more scenarios than what you can ever test. So that's why you have to use a risk-based testing. I don't think you can do this with acceptance criteria. All right, now, we already discussed those. The case for scenarios, much more concrete, much more precise, detailed, allow you for focusing on positive and negative scenarios, but also allow you to do some risk-based testing. Now, the last word here, so that I don't confuse you. I don't care what you do, just use one process and stick to it. You can just continue to use your user stories and acceptance criteria. You could even continue to use user stories without acceptance criteria, but that's not the best practice. All right, you can eliminate your acceptance criteria and substitute them by scenarios here, so you write scenarios for acceptance criteria, or you do like what some people told me they're doing now after they learned about scenarios. They continue to use their acceptance criteria, and probably, I mean, I'm told that, well, we cannot really change things, and especially from a testing perspective, testers cannot really make major change to the process. So their process that they use with their developers is that we build the acceptance criteria. But it turns out that they don't like the acceptance criteria very much, so they use them as a starting point to write their scenarios. So they have both acceptance criteria and scenarios, and everyone I'm talking to tells me that they found that scenarios provide them with much more details. That's the last word I want to give you. Now, I got only about 11 minutes to show you how Rommana ALM supports the hybrid approach of acceptance criteria and scenarios. very quick. Allow me please to use my 10 minutes here to show you that. So I'm going to go here very quick, log into one of the sites for Rommana ALM. By the way, Rommana ALM is available for free for 60 days for up to 3 people. So I'm going to log into one of the sites here. I shouldn't take much time to show you this. This is one of the sites we use for, let me just go back here. I should have shown you this diagram. I'm going to close this again. Okay. This is simply the general diagram for Rommana ALM. It does requirements and user stories. This is a complete ALM in one box using one database here, that's SQL Server database. It does project management, it does issue and bug tracking. It does change management in case requirements or user story have changed over time. It does document management, test management, and test design using the scenario-based approach, and requirements and user stories here. It also provides use cases. It is integrated with these components here. So feel free to go to the Rommana website, rommanasoftware.com, and request a free trial for 60 days for up to 3 team members. All right, so I'm going to log in now. And because I have I'm going to log in as a product owner, project manager, and so on. Very quick, I am going to, what you're seeing here is one of the products or the systems here. There are a number of systems on this site. One of them is Rommana ALM itself as a system. So I'm going to start this project. This is one of the projects there. And when you start a project, you can see either the project activities here that allows you to do. So you can see from here what you can do with the project. You can do any number of things, and they are, as you can see, grouped by the nature of the process. This is managing project entities, manage risks, managing use cases, managing anything. This is configuring project entities. But that's just one of the screens you could use to decide what you want to do. Here is another screen, the project, another tab that's called the project workflow, and you could also decide what to do in here. So any one of those. Here, this is the project dashboard that shows you some statistics about your current project, and you can configure those stats any way you want, and you can click on any number to see the data behind it. Okay, I'm not going to spend much time. This demo is not about the project management or the project dashboard, so I'm going to go straight here to user stories. Everything you can do also with Rommana ALM is on the top here. User stories, change requests, test sets, documents. You can click more. You can see ad hoc tests and so on. So I'm going to click on user stories. And the way Rommana supports user stories is the same way exactly it supports requirements. Rommana ALM supports requirements and user stories, as we say, seamlessly. They're the same. In fact, Rommana allows you to do the same kind of things you do with requirements. So I have some functional user stories, I have some quality user stories, I have some regulations. It could be anything. And all these types or these categories, I have some hardware, I have some usability requirements. All these are customizable. I'm going to click on functional here, and these are some user stories. But you also can pay attention here. As I said earlier, some of the requirements are very difficult to describe as a user story. What do? I'm not going to force myself to try to express the requirement as a user story. I'm going to keep it as a requirement here. So look at this requirement here. Make links available in exported requirement test coverage report. Forget about the details. These are actual requirements of the actual Rommana ALM application, by the way. Okay, because you can imagine we use Rommana ALM as an application lifecycle management. We use it to manage the ALM product, the Rommana ALM product. All right, but anyway, so I look at this requirement here. It says, how would I phrase this as a user story? I could have written a user story. Okay, As a user, I'd like to see the links available in the exported requirement test coverage report. Is there a reason to do that? What if I just want to write, make the link available? There is, as I said earlier, there is nothing magic about the format of the user story. If your agile project, if your agile team wanna write user stories, well, be it. Just write user stories. Okay. Now, user stories exist in hierarchy, as we said. The epics, so it's an epic. As a user, I want to be able to configure attribute values for different project entities. Whoa, that's a huge one. That's why it's broken down here to a number of smaller user stories. And any software you use to manage your user stories should allow you to do that. I am going to click on one of those, and then I get into the details of the user story. Okay. So I'm looking now at that user story. A user story would have some description. Same way exactly a requirement would have description. There is nothing on earth that says, well, user stories are supposed to remain simple and sweet and we don't have description for it. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, I want to be able to provide some details for my user story. So I can put the details here. Now I have my acceptance criteria here, and I can add more if I wanted to. Okay, and when I write acceptance criteria later on, I will decide if they have been tested or not, and if they have been tested, then did they pass or fail? Okay, so I can have a number of. This is just an example, guys. Don't think, I don't want you to think that this user story has only 2 acceptance criteria. So this is now how acceptance criteria are handled within Rommana ALM. Now, this user story has 24 scenarios. 24 scenarios. I'm going to click on here to see the scenarios. Okay. And as you can see, I have a scenario name, scenario description, and I have the 3 parameters I told you about: frequency of occurrence, the consequences of failure or impact of failure, the probability of failure, and I have the testing priority calculated as 3. I have the creator, I have everything last modified. I can click on any one of those scenarios to see the details of the scenarios. Okay, now the scenarios are here on the left. Now also pay attention to the breadcrumbs. I'm looking at all the scenarios for the user story. So I am within that user story. If I want to go back to the user story, I can click on that. Okay, now even more details about scenarios. Of course, the purpose of scenarios, we're going to take them later on and write some test cases. Some formal test cases with some scripts to be executed. Well, that scenario happened not to have any test cases written. I can certainly create a new test case, but that scenario happened to have an ad hoc test case. In Rommana ALM, testing can happen in 2 ways. You either write formal test cases or ad hoc / exploratory test cases. And that's very important though, because, and as you can see here, that shows the test case passed. That's very important for a reason. Remember, I told you, if you use a methodology, you're going to come up with more scenarios, much more scenarios than what you can ever test. Now, you're going to use the risk-based analysis as we discussed here, and you're going to say, okay, I've got all these scenarios. Do I have time to test all those? No. So I can sort this on the testing priority, right? And I can see that those are the higher priority scenarios. Well, all of them are 2.33. The lowest is 2.33. I don't have anything lower than that. What if I have 100 scenarios and a bunch of them are priority 1 or 1.33? Okay, remember, the priority will always be either 1, 1.33, 1.66, 2.0, 2.33, 2.66, or 3.0. Why? Because you're calculating the average of 3 parameters, and the 3 parameters are either 1 or 2 or 3. Okay, so this is a math. So what if I have a bunch of scenarios that are 1 and 1.3? Do I have time to test all of them with the same level of rigor and formality that I test all the scenarios that are level 3? Of course not. And that's why we have the concept of ad hoc / exploratory testing. We say, okay, we're going to take the higher level priority scenarios. We're going to test them formally by writing test cases, but then we're going to take the lower level scenarios, the lower priority scenarios, and test them using ad hoc tests. And here, if I click here, so now you see the navigation. I went from a user story to scenario 17 to ad hoc test number 12. Now I'm looking at the ad hoc. This is how Rommana ALM does exploratory testing. Some people don't like the word ad hoc, so we can call it exploratory, but the purpose, the meaning is that it's a test case that was written quick. All what it has a title, it has description, and expected results and actual results. That's all what it has. All right, I'm gonna have to stop here because I am already exactly at my time limit here. I'm gonna peek into the questions panel quick to see if I have questions or comments. All right. Our organization uses user stories with acceptance criteria. We also write specifications. Okay. Rachel, thank you so much for attending this webinar. I know you attended the webinar from last week and you had posed the same question that people confuse acceptance criteria and the specifications. So and I'm going to have to assume that when you say specifications, you mean the requirements. And as I see, you're saying you need to maintain those specifications because of the nature of the projects you're working on. And I have to agree with you 100% that some people write acceptance criteria that looks like requirements. So I hope you've been with me from the beginning when I talked about the difference between acceptance criteria and scenarios. And I hope you could see that scenarios kind of solve the problem. I have to be honest with you, I don't have a way to help those people who confuse between acceptance criteria and specifications or requirements. Why? Because that's the way acceptance criteria are. We don't have guidance as of how to write acceptance criteria. Okay? If you look at the acceptance criteria examples that were given to me by the audience today, show portal or system to capture the booking. I mean, of course, you can look at this acceptance criteria and say, well, that looks like a requirement. It's a low-level requirement. Or someone else saying, show the upgrade and downgrade options. That's equivalent to saying that the system shall allow people to either upgrade or downgrade, right? So you're absolutely right. People write acceptance criteria that may look like a requirement. It may not be a high-level requirement, but it is low-level requirement. And that's really one of the problems and one of the reasons I'm personally discouraged to use acceptance criteria. So hopefully you could see how scenarios, they give you guidance of what's included in the user story and what not. The short answer to your question is this. There is no way to avoid confusing acceptance criteria with requirements. And many people will write acceptance criteria that look like requirements. And that's one of the reasons I don't like acceptance criteria. Okay. Now, when we talk about scenarios, we are really limited to think about what? We are thinking about situations, conditions, all right? Events that could possibly happen in production. If you think this way, in every system, there are those situations. You will not have the problem of confusing scenarios with requirements. All right, very quick here. Let me peek if there's any other question. No other question. Thank you so much to all of you for being with me today. I hope you found the webinar to be useful. As I said, this webinar is being recorded now and will be available at the Rommana website sometime next week. When you get the link to the recording, please feel free to share it with other team members. Thank you.